They were teenagers who had never left their hometowns. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from Boston. They grew up during the Great Depression, knowing poverty and hardship. Then they were handed rifles, put on ships, and sent to fight the deadliest war in human history. These were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. They stormed beaches under machine gun fire, fought through jungles infested with disease, and watched their friends die beside them. They were called the greatest generation, not because they sought glory, but because when their country called, they answered. These are their stories. Dick Winters was 26 years old when he jumped into Normandy with the 101st Airborne on D-Day. Before the war, he had been a quiet kid from Pennsylvania, planning to work in business. The war turned him into one of the most respected officers in the American military. On D-Day, Winters and his men were scattered across the French countryside. Their unit was supposed to land together. Instead, they were dropped miles from their objective in complete darkness. Winters landed in a field, alone, with gunfire in every direction. He had to find his men, regroup, and somehow complete their mission. What happened next became legendary. Winters led a small group of paratroopers in an assault on German artillery positions at Brecourt Manor, guns that were firing on Utah Beach. With just a dozen men against 50 Germans, Winters used textbook infantry tactics to systematically destroy each gun position. His actions that day saved countless lives on the beach below and earned him a Bronze Star. But when people asked him about his heroism, Winters always deflected. He would talk about his men instead, the ones who didn't make it home. He carried their names with him for the rest of his life. That was typical of these veterans. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They were just doing their job, trying to survive, looking out for the guys next to them. The real heroes, they would say, were the ones who didn't come back. Ray Lambert was a medic with the 1st Infantry Division. On June 6, 1944, he landed at Omaha Beach in the first wave, the most dangerous assault of D-Day. The ramp of his landing craft dropped, and immediately men started dying. German machine guns swept the beach. War was equally brutal, and in many ways more horrific. Eugene Sledge was a Marine who fought at Peleliu and Okinawa. He was 19 years old when he entered combat. Before the war, he had been a college student interested in biology. The Pacific turned him into something he barely recognized. Sledge kept a journal throughout the war, hidden from his officers who had forbidden it. Decades later, he turned that journal into a book that became one of the most honest accounts of combat ever written. He didn't romanticize or glorify war. He described it exactly as it was, dirty, terrifying, and dehumanizing. He wrote about the constant fear, never knowing when a sniper's bullet would find you, about the smell of rotting corpses that permeated everything, about watching his friends get torn apart by artillery, about the Marine who collected gold teeth from dead Japanese soldiers, sometimes before they were completely dead, about how combat stripped away civilization and reduced men to something primal. At Peleliu, temperatures exceeded 115 degrees. Men died of heat stroke as often as enemy fire. Water was scarce. The coral rock made digging foxholes nearly impossible. The Japanese hid in caves and had to be burned out with flamethrowers. The fighting was close, personal, and savage. Sledge survived the war physically intact, but emotionally scarred. He struggled with what we now call PTSD for years. He had nightmares, couldn't hold down a job, and felt disconnected from normal life. Eventually, he found peace by becoming a biology professor and writing about his experiences, turning his trauma into a warning about the true cost of war. The greatest generation wasn't just men. Women served too, though their stories are often forgotten. Over 350,000 women served in uniform during World War II. They were nurses, pilots, mechanics, code breakers, and everything in between. They faced danger, discrimination, and the same trauma as their male counterparts, but rarely received the same recognition. Flight nurses like Alita Lutz flew into combat zones to evacuate wounded soldiers. They landed on makeshift airstrips under fire, loaded critically injured men onto planes, and provided medical care during flights back to field hospitals. Lutz completed 196 missions before her plane crashed in 1944, killing her and everyone aboard. She was awarded more decorations than any other woman in American military history. Ruth Cowan was a journalist who covered the war in Europe and North Africa. She was one of the first reporters to enter Paris after liberation, and she covered the Nuremberg trials. In an era when women journalists were expected to write about fashion and society, Cowan covered combat and war crimes. The Women Air Force Service pilots, WASPs, ferried military aircraft across the country, test flew repaired planes, and towed targets for gunnery practice. 38 WASPs died in service. They weren't considered military personnel and weren't eligible for military benefits until 1977, over 30 years after the war ended. These women weren't looking for glory. They saw a need and filled it, proving that courage and service aren't limited by gender. What made this generation greatest wasn't that they enjoyed war or sought it out. It was that they did what needed to be done, despite the terrible cost. Many came home with physical wounds, missing limbs, blindness, disfigurement. Others carried invisible wounds that wouldn't be understood or treated for decades. They had seen things no one should see, done things no one should have to do. And yet, they came home and built a nation. They went to college on the GI Bill, bought houses, started businesses, raised families. They created the post-war economic boom and the American middle class. They didn't complain about their service or demand recognition. They just got on with living. But beneath that stoic exterior, many struggled. Alcoholism, depression, nightmares, and rage were common, but rarely discussed. Men who had commanded platoons and survived combat sometimes couldn't hold down regular jobs. Marriages failed. Some took their own lives years after the war ended. The trauma of war doesn't end when the fighting stops. It echoes through decades, affecting families and communities. The greatest generation paid for victory not just on the battlefield, but for the rest of their lives. If you ever met a World War II veteran, you probably noticed something. They didn't want to talk about the war. Ask them about their service, and they'd change the subject or give brief, sanitized answers. This wasn't false modesty or stubbornness. It was protection, for themselves and for you. How do you explain to someone who wasn't there what it's like to watch your best friend die? How do you describe the feeling of killing another human being? How do you convey the terror of combat to someone who's never experienced it? And why would you want to burden them with those memories? Veterans kept their stories locked away because the reality of war is too terrible to share with people you love. They didn't want their children to know what they had done or seen. They didn't want their wives to know how close they came to dying or how scared they were. They wanted to protect their families from the darkness they carried. When veterans did talk, it was usually to other veterans, people who understood without needing explanation. In VFW halls and American Legion posts, they could share stories with people who had been there, who knew what combat was really like. It's only now, as the last World War II veterans reach their final years, that many have started opening up. They realize their stories need to be told, not to glorify war, but to ensure people understand what that generation endured. August 1942. For 8 months, America had been losing. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Wake Island, defeat after defeat. Then came Guadal Canal, a jungle-covered island in the Solomon chain that most Americans had never heard of. The mission seemed simple: capture a Japanese airfield. The reality was 6 months of hell. Marines landed on August 7th and quickly captured the unfinished airfield, renaming it Henderson Field. Then the Japanese counterattacked with everything they had. For 6 months, American forces clung to a narrow perimeter around that airfield while Japanese ships bombarded them at night. Japanese aircraft attacked during the day, and Japanese infantry launched savage attacks from the jungle. The conditions were nightmare fuel. Daytime temperatures exceeded 100 degrees with suffocating humidity. Rain turned everything to mud. Malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery were endemic. Disease casualties often exceeded combat casualties. Soldiers lost 20, 30, even 40 pounds. Food was scarce. Supplies couldn't get through. Men ate captured Japanese rice and fought while sick with fever. The jungle itself was an enemy. Visibility was measured in feet. Snipers tied themselves into trees. Soldiers on patrol couldn't see the man 5 feet ahead. Night was worse. Japanese soldiers infiltrated American lines under cover of darkness, and terrified Marines shot at shadows. But the worst were the banzai charges. Japanese soldiers, screaming and firing, would charge American positions in waves, willing to die for the Emperor. Marines had to shoot men who kept coming, even after being hit multiple times. The psychological toll was immense. Private Robert Leckie, who fought at Guadalcanal, described nights where Japanese soldiers would scream in English, "Marine, you die tonight," trying to terrorize defenders. He described men cracking under the strain, shooting at nothing, unable to distinguish reality from hallucination. The sacrifice at Guadalcanal was measured not just in casualties, but in what it took from survivors. Men who went in as teenagers came out hollow-eyed and haunted. Of the 60,000 Americans who fought on Guadalcanal, 7,100 were killed or wounded, but thousands more were permanently marked by disease, exhaustion, and psychological trauma. Yet they held. For 6 months, they held that airfield against everything Japan could throw at them. In February 1943, Japan evacuated, conceding defeat. It was America's first major offensive victory, proof that the Japanese could be beaten. But the cost had been staggering. December 16th, 1944. The war in Europe seemed almost won. Allied forces were approaching Germany's borders. Then Hitler launched his final, desperate gamble, a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest in Belgium. 250,000 German troops smashed into thinly held American lines. Entire units were surrounded and cut off. The Germans pushed 50 miles into Allied territory, creating a bulge in the front lines. It was the largest and bloodiest battle fought by American forces in World War II, and it happened in winter, the worst winter in decades. Temperatures dropped below zero. Snow was waist-deep. Men fought in conditions that seemed designed to kill them, even without enemy action. Soldiers developed trench foot, frostbite, and hypothermia. Some froze to death in foxholes. Weapons froze and wouldn't fire. Tanks couldn't move through the snow. Wounded men who weren't evacuated quickly froze to death. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded at Bastogne, a crucial crossroads town. 18,000 American paratroopers and support troops were encircled by German forces. They were outnumbered, outgunned, running low on ammunition and medical supplies, and cut off from relief. When the German commander demanded surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe sent back a one-word reply: "Nuts!" For 7 days, the 101st held Bastogne against constant German attacks. Men fought from frozen foxholes. Artillery shells exploded among the trees, sending deadly splinters flying. Medics performed amputations in freezing conditions without adequate supplies. Wounded men lay in the snow, waiting for evacuation that might not come. Private Kurt Vonnegut was captured during the Battle of the Bulge and witnessed the aftermath of the Dresden firebombing as a POW. The experience would haunt him for life and inspire his novel Slaughterhouse-Five. Thousands of other soldiers carried similar trauma home with them. The sacrifice wasn't just about dying, it was about enduring, holding positions in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance, watching friends freeze to death, fighting when exhausted, sick, and terrified, going days without hot food or sleep. When relief finally arrived on December 26th, the men who stumbled out of Bastogne were barely recognizable. Gaunt, frostbitten, hollow-eyed. They had held because surrendering meant their comrades' deaths would be meaningless. They had held because giving up wasn't an option. The Battle of the Bulge lasted until January 25, 1945. American casualties: 19,000 killed, 47,500 wounded, 23,000 captured or missing. It was the bloodiest battle in American history. But the line held, Hitler's last offensive failed, and the road to Germany lay open. February 19, 1945. Iwo Jima was 8 square miles of volcanic rock and ash, barely significant enough to appear on most maps. But it had airfields that could support B-29 bombers striking Japan, and that made it essential. The Japanese knew this too. They had turned the island into a fortress, with 21,000 defenders dug into an elaborate network of tunnels and bunkers. They wouldn't defend the beaches. They would let Marines land, then kill them from hidden positions. Every yard would cost American lives. The Marines thought it would take 4 days. It took 36. The beach was black volcanic sand that made it nearly impossible to dig foxholes. Japanese artillery and mortars had pre-sighted every inch of the landing zones. As Marines came ashore, they were torn apart by fire from positions they couldn't even see. Men tried to take cover but found no cover existed. Sergeant John Basilone, a Medal of Honor recipient from Guadal Canal who could have stayed home as a hero, insisted on returning to combat. He was killed on the first day at Iwo Jima, cut down by artillery while helping his men move forward. He had survived the hell of Guadal Canal, only to die on a beach of volcanic ash. The fighting was savage and personal. Japanese soldiers hid in caves and had to be burned out with flamethrowers. Tunnels connected positions, allowing defenders to appear behind American lines. Hand-to-hand combat was common. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Marines fought for 5 days just to reach the base of Mount Suribachi, the island's highest point. On February 23rd, a patrol reached the summit and raised an American flag. A few hours later, a larger flag was raised, and Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal captured the moment. That photograph became the most reproduced image in history. It showed 6 men raising the flag together, a perfect symbol of American unity and sacrifice. 3 of those 6 men would be dead within days. The survivors carried guilt for the rest of their lives, feeling unworthy of being called heroes, while so many others died unremembered. The battle continued for another month after the flag raising. Every pillbox had to be destroyed. Every cave had to be cleared. The Japanese fought literally to the last man. Only 216 of 21,000 defenders surrendered. American casualties: 6,821 killed and 19,217 wounded. Nearly one-third of all Marines who landed on Iwo Jima became casualties. Admiral Nimitz said, "Uncommon valor was a common virtue at Iwo Jima. But valor came at an uncommon price." What do these three battles have in common? They were all fights that could have been avoided. Guadal Canal wasn't vital to American security. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's dying rage. Iwo Jima's strategic value has been debated for decades. But they happened, and men died. Not for abstract principles or grand strategy, but for immediate reasons. To save the man next to them, to complete the mission they'd been given, to not let their friends down. The soldiers at Guadal Canal didn't endure 6 months of jungle hell thinking about the bigger strategic picture. They endured because their buddies were enduring. The paratroopers at Bastogne didn't hold out in the frozen siege because of the future of Europe. They held because surrendering meant abandoning each other. The Marines on Iwo Jima didn't charge machine gun positions, thinking about airfield capacity. They did it because their sergeant told them to, and because the men to their left and right were doing it too. This is the nature of combat sacrifice. It's not about flags or nations or ideology. It's intensely personal. It's about the people immediately around you. You fight for your squad, your platoon, your unit. You sacrifice because not sacrificing means your friends sacrifice more. The names of these battles, Guadal Canal, Bulge, Iwo Jima, still resonate decades later. They represent something beyond military history. They represent moments when ordinary people were pushed to extraordinary limits and somehow found the strength to keep going. But we should remember that strength came at terrible cost. The men who survived these battles carried them forever. They had nightmares. They struggled with survivors' guilt. They couldn't explain to their families what they'd seen and done. Many turned to alcohol or withdrew into themselves. Some never really came home. The iconic photograph from Iwo Jima became a symbol of victory, but the men in it knew a different truth. René Gagnon, one of the flag raisers, said years later that he wasn't a hero. The real heroes were the ones who didn't come back. Ira Hayes, another flag raiser and a Native American who faced discrimination even after his famous act, struggled with alcoholism and died at 32. Victory photographs and heroic narratives are important for morale and memory, but they can obscure the human cost. The lives ended, the minds shattered, the families broken. April 9th, 1942. After months of desperate fighting, 76,000 American and Filipino troops surrendered to Japanese forces on the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines. It was the largest surrender in American military history. What followed was one of the war's worst atrocities. The Japanese forced their prisoners to march over 60 miles to prison camps in scorching heat with no food, no water, and no rest. Men who fell were bayoneted or shot. Those who stopped to help fallen comrades were killed alongside them. The sick and wounded were left to die on the roadside. Private Leon Beck described watching Japanese soldiers behead prisoners with swords for sport. He saw men buried alive. He watched guards beat prisoners to death for asking for water. The march wasn't just brutal, it was deliberately murderous. Thousands died during the march itself. Estimates range from 5,000 to 18,000 deaths. The exact number will never be known because bodies were left where they fell. Those who survived the march faced years of captivity that were equally horrific. The Bataan Death March set the tone for how Japan would treat American POWs throughout the war. To the Japanese military, surrender was the ultimate disgrace. Prisoners had forfeited their right to be treated as human beings. They were less than nothing. American prisoners of war in Japanese camps faced conditions that violated every standard of human decency. Starvation was deliberate policy. Daily rations consisted of a bowl of rice with perhaps some thin soup. Men lost 50, 60, even 80 pounds. They became walking skeletons. Malnutrition led to beriberi, pellagra, and other diseases. Men went blind from vitamin deficiencies. Their teeth fell out. Their bodies consumed themselves. Medical care was virtually non-existent. Prisoners suffered from malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, and tropical ulcers that ate through flesh to the bone. Without medicine or proper treatment, simple infections became death sentences. Surgeons performed amputations without anesthesia, using whatever tools they could find. Prisoners were forced to work as slave laborers in mines, on railroads, and in factories. The Burma-Thailand Railway, the Death Railway, was built by Allied POWs and Asian laborers under conditions so brutal that one prisoner died for every railroad tie laid. Men worked 16-hour days in tropical heat, beaten constantly, with no adequate food or medical care. Punishment for even minor infractions was savage. Guards beat prisoners with rifle butts, bamboo clubs, and fists. Men were forced to kneel on sharp stones for hours under the sun. Some were tied to posts and left in the heat without water. Escape attempts resulted in execution, and sometimes collective punishment where entire groups of prisoners were killed. Louis Zamperini, whose story was told in the book and film Unbroken, survived a plane crash and 47 days adrift at sea, only to be captured and sent to multiple Japanese prisoner-of-war camps. He was singled out by a sadistic guard nicknamed the Bird, who beat him daily, trying to break his spirit. Zamperini survived by clinging to memories of home and refusing to let his captors destroy his humanity. The mortality rate for American POWs held by Japan was 40%, compared to just 1% for those held by Germany. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of systematic brutality, deliberate starvation, and a complete disregard for prisoner welfare. The experience of American POWs in German camps was dramatically different, though still far from pleasant. Germany generally followed the Geneva Convention for Western Allied prisoners. POWs received Red Cross parcels, could send and receive mail, and weren't systematically worked to death. Camp conditions were harsh, food was scarce, winters were brutal, and crowding was severe. But prisoners weren't deliberately starved or beaten as policy. Stalag Luft III, made famous by the movie The Great Escape, held Allied airmen. Despite being behind barbed wire, prisoners organized classes, put on theatrical productions, and maintained military discipline. They also dug escape tunnels, not just to escape, but to maintain morale and resist in whatever way they could. The famous tunnel escape in March 1944 saw 76 men break out. Only 3 made it to freedom. 50 were executed on Hitler's direct order, a war crime that shocked the POW community. But even this tragedy showed the difference between German and Japanese captivity. Prisoners felt they could attempt escape without their entire camp being massacred in retaliation. However, we shouldn't romanticize German POW camps. Conditions deteriorated badly as the war progressed. Food became scarce. Prisoners froze in unheated barracks. Guards became more brutal. And toward the end, as Allied forces approached, German guards forced prisoners on long marches in winter conditions. Many died from exposure, starvation, and exhaustion. Moreover, treatment varied dramatically based on who you were. Soviet POWs in German camps died by the millions through deliberate neglect and murder. African American prisoners of war faced discrimination even in captivity. But for white American servicemen, German captivity, while harsh, was survivable. How did POWs survive years of captivity? Physical endurance was important, but psychological resilience was crucial. Prisoners created communities. They looked after each other, sharing food even when starving. In Japanese camps, men formed small groups, usually 4 or 5 men who would pool resources and keep each other alive. If one man got sick, the others would give him their food. If someone lost hope, the group would drag him along until he found the will to continue. Maintaining military structure helped preserve dignity and purpose. Senior officers continued to command, giving orders and maintaining discipline. This structure gave prisoners a sense that they were still soldiers, not just victims. It provided meaning and purpose in an otherwise meaningless existence. Resistance took many forms. In German camps, prisoners dug escape tunnels, forged documents, and created elaborate deception operations. In Japanese camps, where such activities would result in death, resistance was more subtle, stealing food, sabotaging work, maintaining small acts of defiance that preserved self-respect. Mental escape was crucial. Men would describe elaborate meals to each other, planning exactly what they'd eat when they got home. They'd tell stories about their families, their hometowns, their lives before the war. Some prisoners mentally designed houses or planned business ventures. These dreams of the future gave them reason to survive today. Faith sustained many. Religious services, even when forbidden, continued in secret. Prayer gave comfort and hope. Some men credited their survival to divine intervention, the belief that God had a plan for them and they would make it home. When camps were finally liberated, American forces encountered scenes of horror. Men weighed 70 or 80 pounds, barely alive. Many couldn't walk. Their bodies were covered in ulcers and sores. They suffered from dysentery, malaria, and malnutrition so severe that doctors worried they might die from eating normal food too quickly. The psychological state of liberated POWs was equally concerning. Some were euphoric, crying and hugging their liberators. Others were catatonic, unable to process that their ordeal was over. Many couldn't believe they were actually free. Years of captivity had broken their ability to hope. The journey home was complicated. POWs had to be slowly rehabilitated, their bodies carefully nursed back to health. But the psychological wounds ran deeper and would take far longer to heal. Many former POWs struggled for decades with what we now call PTSD. They had nightmares. Loud noises triggered panic. They couldn't discuss their experiences with families who couldn't possibly understand. Some turned to alcohol to numb the memories. Others withdrew into themselves, unable to reconnect with normal life. The Japanese POWs particularly struggled. They had survived horrors that American society couldn't comprehend. When they tried to talk about it, people didn't believe them or thought they were exaggerating. The brutality they described seemed impossible in the civilized 20th century. The experience of being a POW didn't end with liberation. It cast a shadow over entire lives. Many former POWs spent decades seeking recognition and justice. They wanted the world to know what happened, to acknowledge their suffering, and to hold their captors accountable. The war crimes trials prosecuted some of the worst offenders, but many escaped justice. Former POWs of Japan fought for decades to receive apology and compensation. Japan's official stance remained ambiguous, acknowledging regrettable incidents, but rarely admitting systematic brutality. This lack of acknowledgement added insult to injury, suggesting their suffering wasn't real or wasn't important. The POW experience also strengthened some men. They had survived the worst humanity could inflict. They had maintained their dignity and humanity in circumstances designed to strip both away. This gave them perspective. Ordinary problems seemed trivial compared to what they'd endured. Many became successful in business or public service, driven by a determination to make their survival meaningful. But the cost was always there. In quiet moments, the memories returned. The smell of rice cooking could trigger flashbacks. The sound of shouting in a foreign language could cause panic attacks. Their bodies, weakened by years of malnutrition and disease, deteriorated faster than those of other veterans. The story of American POWs in World War II is ultimately a story about human resilience. These men endured conditions that should have broken them. Many did break, no shame in that. But many also survived, maintained their humanity, and returned home to build lives. Their survival wasn't about being physically stronger or mentally tougher than those who died. Often it was luck, being in the right place at the right time, avoiding disease, not being selected for execution. The survivors knew this and carried guilt about outliving their comrades. What their experience teaches us is that human beings can endure almost anything if they have hope, community, and purpose. The POWs who survived weren't superhuman. They were ordinary men who found extraordinary reserves of strength when pushed to the absolute limit. They remind us that dignity isn't something that can be taken away by force. It's something you maintain through choice, through small acts of defiance, through refusing to let circumstances define you. Even in the worst conditions imaginable, stripped of freedom and basic necessities, prisoners found ways to remain human. That's the legacy of American POWs in World War II. Not just that they survived, but how they survived, and what their survival says about the resilience of the human spirit.